give us a very big picture of Romans and then go back and look into the details. But we start out the argument in really chapters 1 through 4 are going to focus on there's no distinction in humanity. Okay, all have fallen short of the glory of God. So Jews don't have an advantage. Gentiles are not disadvantaged. God still speaks to them. So there's really kind of this emphasis on the unity, I could say it maybe that way, sounds odd, but the unity of humanity under judgment. So God's plan is for all people. And if you remember, I talked about the background as being possibly some kind of rift in Rome. When the Jews were kicked out of Rome, then there was probably a lot of Gentiles who filled in positions of leadership. And so that left kind of a problem when the Jews came back, Jewish followers of Jesus, to not really have unity in the church. So that's one possible thing that we'd look at. Then we get into kind of beginning to get into Romans 5 through 8. That's not exactly the right division, but in that focus then we're going to start looking more applied to individuals. So we're going to see that God's solution is if sin came through one person, Adam, then God's solution is going to come through one human being, Jesus. Obviously, Jesus is fully God and fully human, but it's that parallel that's important. Then there's in 6 and 7 kind of a struggle about the whole process that is needed for a believer to actually come to faith. So the whole struggle that goes on within the person about wanting to do the right thing but not doing the right thing, I think that actually applies to Christians as well. We can talk more about that passage. But all of that leads up then to the discussion about the Spirit in chapter 8. Then in chapters 9 through 11, there's a very interesting discussion about, well, what about Israel? What about God's promises to his people? How does that factor in? And then 12 to 15 is more practical. I mean, I think all of it's practical, but it starts out in 12 with offering up our bodies as living sacrifices, and then the rest of 12 to 15 unpacks what that looks like in all kinds of different dimensions in life. And then Romans 16 is this wonderful series of kind of greetings and salutations, which again is in a first century context, you would have the greetings at the end for letter writing. So as much as there's so much detail and it's not always easy to track that detail, there really is a sustained argument that holds Romans together. And really, I would say one of the ways to think about it is the power of the gospel. The power of the gospel. And the gospel transforms. So that's really the backdrop of this. Okay, we talked a little bit yesterday about the impact that a verse coming out of chapter 1 had on Martin Luther. So let's look at the context here. And as I said, there's this introduction where the opening introduction, the opening kind of identification of Paul as an apostle is longer than normal. Probably Paul is wanting to remind the audience of his apostolic authority and the basis for his preaching. And then we move into a discussion of how much he wants to visit the believers in Rome, is not able to at that point in time. But all of that leads up to verse 16 in chapter 1 that I read yesterday, but I want to just remind us of it. Verse 16, "For I am not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first and also to the Greek, for it is the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith." And that's a quote from Habakkuk. So what's interesting is that notice how that context, that phrase, first to the Jew, then to the Gentile, is actually given to underscore the unity. That's a little bit hard for us to understand because sometimes we hear that and we think that there's a priority, that it means that the Jews are privileged and then the Gentiles or the Greeks, as this is translated, get the leftovers. And that's certainly not what's being communicated. Really, it's more a statement about God and God's faithfulness to keep his promises. So if you remember, we've talked about this several times, but God's way of dealing with humanity, so to speak, is to focus on an individual, focus on one, through whom will come a blessing to many. So we could just start that pattern with Abraham, as we've talked about before, that in Abraham, God chooses one. And you could say, well, that's not fair. What about all the others? Well, I would also kind of say that's partly because God knows how we are wired, and we deal relationally. I mean, we are hardwired to interact relationally. And I won't underscore this again, but I've talked about it a couple times, but I think I mentioned the studies that show a series of really, really quick objects that are shown to humans. And if any of them even look like a face, it could be a smiley face, but even look like a face, human brains react differently. And so it's really, in a sense, I mean, we are hardwired for relationship. So in that context, it makes sense that God would choose one, because one is how we interact with other human beings. So if God is going to reveal himself, if he were to reveal himself in abstract principles to everybody all at the same time, that's not how we were created. We're created for relationship, therefore we relate to individuals. So through one individual, God is eventually going to bring forth his people so that they also relationally will extend God's rule and share who God is. So all of that's just to kind of remind us that when Paul understands that the gospel goes first to the Jew, then to the Gentile, that's not favoritism. That's really God saying, I keep my promises. I made a particular promise to a group of people, and I will reveal my faithfulness to them, but as we've seen all along, all of God's promises to the Jews, all of God's promises to the nation Israel, everything that's happening is always for the context of the nations around, the surrounding nations. So to say, for Paul to remind the church in Rome that God's promises are first to the Jew, then to the Gentile, is really a way of saying God's plan has been for everyone. Even if he historically has worked through the particular, it has always been for everyone. And then he talks about he's not ashamed of that. As we talked about before, in a Greek context, there would be a certain kind of foolishness that would be associated with the gospel or with the cross, with the idea of a Savior being crucified on the cross. So all of those kinds of things. So that's just rescoring something that we talked about. Then he talks about the righteousness of God is revealed from faith. And then he quotes from Habakkuk and talks about that the righteous shall live by faith. So again, what he's trying to do, I think it's really interesting that he pulls that whole idea of the righteous living by faith from the Old Testament. And one of the things that I want to keep stressing as we look at this argument is, and we've talked about in other contexts, is that a lot of times people have this idea that the Old Testament is law and works, and the New Testament is grace and faith. But isn't it interesting that Paul cites an Old Testament verse to talk about the fact that the righteous live by faith? That's very interesting. So that dichotomy that we bring to the text actually does not exist in the text. So the point that he's trying to stress here is that really, in order to be made righteous before God, it is a question of faith. Then he goes on in a passage that some of us are probably more familiar with, and that is in the rest of chapter 1, there is God's wrath is being revealed against fallen humanity. And as many people have noted, and I absolutely agree, but it's a couple comments here. This is a spiraling, and so the depravity keeps getting worse and worse, which I think is true, that if human sin is not checked at some level, it does just increasingly get worse. But I think what's interesting that I always am struck by is that if you kind of look buried in that spiral, in verse 21, it says, "For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God and give thanks to him." Now, it says right in the middle of verse 21, and a couple of things comments I'd like to make about that. Paul, or this part of Romans, is sometimes criticized because people say that what Paul is arguing is that somehow natural revelation is sufficient to bring a person into saving faith. I don't think that's what Paul is arguing at all. Now, what I mean by natural revelation, obviously, is things like when it's not raining and we can actually see the stars. If you've ever been in a place where there's not a lot of light pollution and you can actually see the stars and see the Milky Way, there is something within us that just is quickened in our heart, and we recognize that there is a creator God. Then he goes on, and in that context, there's really the argument is God has revealed himself to humanity, therefore humanity is without excuse. We can't really unpack this, but there are some implications from this text about, proverbially, when people say, what about the person in, the Upper Zambezi or Outer Mongolia who's never heard the gospel? A couple of things I think are important. Over and over and over, missionaries attest to this reality, that frequently when missionaries go into areas that are unreached people groups, so to speak, it is not uncommon for groups of people to have some kind of legend, some kind of defining narrative for their group that has a connection somehow to the Creator God, and in many respects prepares them to hear the gospel. A person who's done the most work on this is somebody named Don Richardson, and he's written a book called Eternity in Their Hearts, but that's from Ecclesiastes. That's also his website, so if you Google that, not now, but if you Google that, you can find all kinds of really good information about how God does reach people. And he doesn't suggest that they, again, apart from the gospel, that people can come into a saving relationship, but what he focuses on is the amazing ways that God prepares people to hear the gospel. And I think that's important. I really think that's an important thing to underscore. And we live in a context where increasingly many people in our immediate context are unreached people groups. If you think about many people growing up in a context where they don't have any exposure to anything religious. Then that leads us into chapter 2. And in chapter 2, he's going to talk about two different conditions in humanity. Those who have not received the law, and he talks about them, even their conscience has the ability to convict them. So it's not really a law unto themselves that's parallel to the Sinaitic law, but that individual humans have something inside of them that can bother them, that can cause them to start wondering and asking hard questions. And there's a lot of discussion about this because it's hard to find things that are universally viewed as wrong throughout cultures. But there are some things. I mean, in cannibalistic cultures, you could argue that murder is not viewed as wrong, but actually there's often a lot of rules, if that makes sense. I mean, there's a lot of things that show that even just taking somebody's life is not done flippantly. So, and that's a difficult question to talk about, but I think it's interesting because what Paul is trying to show here is even those who don't have the law still have something that causes them to know the difference between right and wrong, or to have a sense that they're not doing something right. And so he has that argument. Then he flips the argument and talks about, well, what about the Jews? Do they have an advantage? Because they have the oracles of God. Does that give them some kind of advantage? And Paul's argument on that is no, it doesn't. I mean, it's a great thing that they've been entrusted. This is a great honor. But no, it doesn't give them an advantage as far as salvation is concerned. And then, of course, I'll just read a couple of the passages here, but it just goes on to say, I'll just pick in the middle of the argument, verse 9, chapter 2, verse 9, there will be tribulation and distress for every human being who does evil, the Jew first and also the Greek. But glory and honor and peace for everyone who does good, the Jew first and also the Greek, for God shows no partiality. So again, that historical background that we talked about helps to give a little bit of the context of what Paul is saying here. And that is, even if there might be a priority to underscore God's faithfulness, there isn't a partiality. And the expression I've used before that I think is really helpful is we're all equal at the foot of the cross. So our standing, we're all equal in our conviction of sin, and our standing, the basis of our worth, is all the same. As individuals we are, there's not one of us by anything that we've done that puts us at a higher standing, so to speak. It's all at the cross. And that's really the essence of Paul's argument. Okay, so then he goes on to talk about the judgment that comes from that. And in chapter 3, he talks about how universally people are slaves to sin. So he's really getting into the concept of universals that apply. And that, of course, leads us to a passage that we're all pretty familiar with, I think. But in Romans 3, verse 21, Now the righteousness of God has been manifest apart from the law, although the law and the prophets bear witness to it. Now this is really remarkable. Remember when we were talking about Galatians, and I talked about that the promise is given to Abraham before the law. So when the law comes, if the promise, and God's promises always come to pass, if the promise is given before the law, then that would mean that the law cannot be the means by which the promise is fulfilled. Interestingly, Paul is making a similar argument here where he talks about that there's a righteousness that is revealed apart from the law. The law gives witness to it, but notice he says, and the prophets give witness to it. So what he's trying to get out is that understanding righteousness, and where he's going to go with this eventually is going to be that it's God's righteousness. It's God's righteousness that's revealed. But what he's trying to do is to get away from the idea that works of the law bring about righteousness. Remember, we already have this echoing in our mind that the righteous will live by faith. So that's still kind of echoing through this passage. And it goes on to say, the righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there is no distinction. All have sinned and fall short of the glory of God and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Jesus Christ, whom God put forward as propitiation by his blood to be received by faith. This was to show God's righteousness because in his divine forbearance he passed over former sins. It was to show his righteousness at the present time so that he might be the just and the justifier, to the one who has faith in Jesus Christ. Okay, so let me unpack a few things there, because really the argument is brilliant. But what he's trying to do is to show that really God's judgment reveals that there is a righteous standard. So it's not just the law that reveals that there's a righteous standard. It attests to the fact. But remarkably, God is just because he holds people to a standard. I mean, there's all kinds of parallels I can make. They're not going to be sufficient. But, if you think about students or if you think about children, one of the things that develops character is when you hold somebody to something. When the rules are clear and when a person knows that there will be consequences if they don't do something or they don't obey the rules or whatever the context is, that's actually one of the ways that we mature, that we grow. And so part of what Paul is trying to say is God is just because his assessment of human sin justly brings about judgment. What's remarkable is that not only is he just, but he's the one who justifies. So, you could look at it and you could say, God is not fair. And the response would have to be, you're right, God is not fair, because he's fair to make an assessment about humanity, but it's certainly not fair that he would pay the price as well. When do you have a context where somebody righteously and correctly levies the charge and at the same time says, and I'll pay the charge. I'll take the price, or I'll suffer the consequences. It's also interesting, too, that what he's doing by showing that Jesus' blood is the propitiation, there's a lot of discussion about this. I'll make it kind of quick, but excuse me. Expiation is the idea of covering over. Okay, so if, a long time ago when people wrote on paper, and if they made a mistake, they would sometimes use liquid paper to paint over their mistake. Now, if you have really, you might think devious, your professors might think ingenious, you can always see what was written if you hold it up to the light. Okay, so the liquid paper just covers over the mistake, it doesn't remove it. Whereas propitiation is really the idea of changing so that there's no longer a mistake. It offers up, it satisfies God's wrath such that God no longer, the contention that he has been met. And that's a very important thing to keep in mind. So that's kind of one thing that comes out of this passage that I think is really amazing. But then the fact that this takes place in Christ strongly shows us that Christ has always been the focal point of God's plans and purposes, because the propitiation that's effected by Christ is effective for sins previously committed. And a person could have thought, hey, I got away with it. God isn't keeping track of those things. But the argument that he's really wanting to show here is no, this one sacrifice, this propitiation that satisfies God's wrath, is, in a sense, extending for time past and time forward. I mean, we think about it this way, and I think it's right to think about it this way, but when Jesus died on the cross and was resurrected, none of us were born. I'm assuming everybody in this room has sinned. So Jesus' death on the cross is effective or efficacious forward in time, clearly. But it's also efficacious going back in time for sins that were previously committed. That is a staggering claim. That is a staggering claim. I won't jump too quickly to Hebrews, although, as I often say, all roads do lead to Hebrews. But that is really the argument of Hebrews, because what the author is saying is there wasn't anything wrong with the Levitical system, inherently wrong. It wasn't bad. It was just not effective because it had to be repeated over and over and over. But there is a sacrifice that's once and for all. And that's the essence of what he's talking about. That's obviously the author of Hebrews, but this is a very similar argument here.